The wind had no pity. It was a razor across the high plains of Wyoming, a shrieking thing that scoured the land and left it bare and broken. It tore at the timbers of the abandoned barn, making the whole structure groan like a dying man. Inside, huddled in the deepest shadows, Clara felt the cold sink into her bones, a familiar ache that had been her only constant companion for months. Her world had shrunk to this small, drafty space and the nervous warmth of the mare standing beside her. The horse, a fine-boned chestnut with a white blaze, shifted its weight, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Clara reached out a hand and ran it down the animal's flank, the coarse hair a small comfort against her chapped skin. Her hands were a man's hands, calloused and crisscrossed with scars from rope and rock and the general hardship of a life lived on the run. There was nothing soft left in them. There was nothing soft left in her. She'd stolen the mare, stolen her from the sprawling ranch where her father had once worked, a place owned by a man whose greed was as wide as the sky. That same greed had put her father in an early grave, a bullet in his back over a line on a map. Clara had taken the horse and ridden away, not for revenge, but because it was the only thing of value she could take from a world that had taken everything from her. Now, the horse was both her crime and her salvation, her only link to a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. Her face, when she caught a glimpse of it in a shard of broken glass wedged in the wall, was a stranger's. It was thin and sharp, weathered by sun and wind until the softness of her youth had been burned away, leaving only the hard angles of survival. Grief had carved new lines around her eyes that were perpetually narrowed, scanning the horizon for threats that were always there. Bounty hunters, she thought, or maybe just men with empty bellies and cruel intentions. In this land, they were often one and the same. Her stomach twisted with a hunger that was as sharp as the wind. She had a little jerky, a handful of hardtack, but it would not last. She needed a fire, not just for warmth, but for the courage that a small circle of light could offer against the encroaching dark. She worked methodically, her movements economical and practiced. From her saddlebag, she pulled a small bundle of dried tinder she guarded like gold, and with a flint and steel, she began to strike. Spark after spark died in the damp, cold air. Her fingers grew numb, clumsy, frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at her. It was a foolish emotion, a luxury she could not afford. She forced it down, her jaw tight, and struck again. A tiny spark caught, a flicker of orange on the edge of a piece of dried moss. She hunched over it, shielding it with her body. Her breath held tight in her chest. Gently, she coaxed it, adding slivers of wood, feeding it until a small, hesitant flame finally bloomed in the gloom. It was a weak thing, but it was alive. As the first real warmth began to kiss her face, she heard it, a sound that cut through the howl of the wind. Gunfire. 2 shots, flat and ugly, echoing from the east. Clara froze, her hand instinctively going to the Colt revolver holstered at her hip. She extinguished the small fire with the heel of her boot, plunging the barn back into near darkness. The mare snorted, sensing her alarm. "Easy, girl," she whispered, her voice a rough rasp. She moved to a crack in the barn wall, peering out into the vast, gray emptiness of the plains. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind and the featureless expanse of frozen earth. Then she saw it, a rider, a dark shape against the bruised twilight sky, moving with a desperate, frantic energy. The horse was galloping hard, its gait uneven, and the figure on its back was slumped low over the saddle, clinging on by the sheer will alone. They were not chasing. They were fleeing. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. It could be a trap, a lone rider to draw her out, with others waiting in the wings. She drew the Colt, the cold steel heavy and reassuring in her hand. She was a good shot. Her father had made sure of that. "You might not have a man's strength," he used to say, "but a bullet makes all men equal." The horse was failing. It stumbled, caught itself, then stumbled again, its race against death nearly run. The rider was a dead weight now, barely conscious. They were coming straight for the barn, the only shelter for miles. It was not a choice. It was a last, desperate instinct. Clara flattened herself against the rotting wood, the gun held steady in both hands. The horse, a powerful black gelding, finally gave out 50 yards from the barn, its legs collapsing beneath it. The rider was thrown clear, landing in a heap in the thin, wind-swept snow. He did not move. For a full minute. Clara did not move either. She watched, her breath a ghost in the air, waiting for the posse, the trap to be sprung, but the plains remained empty. The wind howled its lonely song. There was no one else. Cursing herself for a fool, she holstered the revolver and ran out, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The man's horse was trying to rise, its eyes wide with pain and exhaustion. She saw the dark, wet patch on its flank and knew it was finished. A pained noise, half whimper, half groan, came from the man on the ground. He was face down, one arm flung out. A dark stain was spreading across the back of his left shoulder, melting the snow beneath it into a grim slush. She knelt and rolled him over. His face was pale, smeared with dirt and stubble, but he was young, younger than her, perhaps. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but only a dry cough came out. He saw the barn, a dark promise of shelter, and then he saw her, a figure of gray resolve looming over him. Fear flickered in his eyes. He fumbled for the gun at his own hip, his fingers weak and uncooperative. "Do not even think it," Clara said, her voice flat and hard. She drew her own weapon again, the barrel pointed squarely at his chest. "Who are you? Who's chasing you?" He blinked, trying to focus on her face. "No one," he rasped, the word dissolving into another ragged cough. "Just riding." She almost laughed. It was a lie, and a poor one at that. "You and that horse have been ridden half to death. 2 shots, I heard. Looks like one of them found you." His eyes closed, his face contorting in a wave of pain. He was done. His body went slack, his head lolling to the side. He had collapsed at the edge of the small fire pit she had just abandoned. Clara stood over him, the gun still in her hand, her mind racing. Leave him. That was the smart thing to do. A man with a bullet in him was trouble. Trouble brought lawmen, and lawmen brought questions she could not answer. He was nothing to her, just another piece of refuse washed up on the shores of this unforgiving land. She could take his horse, if it could even stand, and ride on, disappear. But his horse was dying, and the man was not far behind. She looked at his pale face, the vulnerability in the line of his jaw, and she saw her father. She saw the way he had looked in that last moment, surprised and broken, lying in the dust. She could not, damn it all, she could not. With a growl of frustration, she holstered her gun. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his, her boots slipping in the snow as she dragged him, inch by painful inch, toward the barn. His head lolled, and a trail of blood marked their path. The effort left her breathless, her muscles screaming in protest. She hauled him just inside the relative shelter of the doorway and let him drop. The mare whinnied nervously, shying away from the scent of blood. "It is all right, girl," Clara grunted, breathing hard. "Just more trouble." She retrieved her saddlebag and knelt beside the stranger. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was her father's old medical kit. It was not much. A few rolls of clean linen, a bottle of carbolic acid that stung the nostrils, a pair of tweezers, and a long, thin probing tool. He had been good at patching up ranch hands and injured livestock, a useful skill that had not saved him. She took out her knife and sliced through the man's thick wool coat and the blood-soaked shirt beneath. The wound was ugly. The bullet had gone in high on the shoulder, tearing a ragged hole. It looked like it had gone clean through, which was a small miracle, but he had lost a lot of blood, and the cold would finish what the bullet had started. He stirred as she began to clean the wound, a low moan escaping his lips. His eyes opened again, clearer this time, filled with suspicion and pain. What are you doing?" "Saving your life, looks like," she said without looking up from her work. "Though I am starting to wonder why." She poured a little of the carbolic acid onto a strip of linen. "This is going to hurt." He flinched and hissed as she pressed the cloth to the entry wound, the antiseptic searing the raw flesh. "Who are you?" he managed to ask through gritted teeth. "The woman who is deciding whether to turn you in for whatever bounty is on your head," she replied, her tone sharp. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She had done this before, for her father, for herself. "No bounty," he whispered, his eyes closing again. "Not yet." She paused, looking at his face. "Men do not get shot for no reason out here." He was silent for a moment, his breathing shallow. "I had a disagreement with my employer." "A disagreement with a gun?" she pressed, packing the wound and beginning to wrap it tightly with a strip of linen. "He was a ranch owner, a man named Silas Croft," he said, the name coming out like a curse. "They will say I murdered him." Clara's hands stilled. Silas Croft. She knew the name. A hard man with a reputation for cruelty. His ranch was 2 days' ride south of where her father had worked. Murder. The word hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. She was harboring a killer. The smart thing, the only sane thing, was to put a bullet in him herself and be done with it. "Did you?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. His eyes met hers. They were a deep brown, and in their depths, she saw not malice, but a bone-deep weariness that mirrored her own. "He drew on me first," he said simply. There was no pleading in his voice, only a flat statement of fact. He believed it, whether it was true or not. She finished tying off the bandage, her knuckles brushing against his cold skin. Outside, the wind picked up another notch, and the first snowflakes began to drift down from the leaden sky. Not light, feathery flakes, but hard, stinging pellets of ice, a sign of a real storm settling in. Within minutes, the world outside the barn doors was a swirling vortex of white, the horizon and the plains vanishing completely. They were cut off, trapped. Clara stood and walked back to the fire pit. She struck her flint again, and this time, the fire caught quickly. She fed it small pieces of wood from a pile of broken timber she had gathered in the corner, building it slowly and carefully. The man watched her, his head propped up against a saddle she had placed under him. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows, making the cavernous barn seem both smaller and more menacing. "Why?" he asked, his voice a little stronger now. "Why help me?" Clara did not look at him. She stared into the flames, her face a hard mask. "My father was killed in a land dispute," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Shot in the back by a foreman who wanted his grazing rights. The law called it self-defense. I call it murder." She finally turned her head, her gaze piercing. "I have seen what men like Silas Croft do, and I have seen what happens to the men who work for them." That was part of the truth. The other part, the part that shamed her, was the thought of the bounty. A man wanted for murdering a wealthy rancher would fetch a high price. Enough money to buy a small plot of land somewhere far away from Wyoming. Enough to start over, to wash the blood and the dust off her life. The thought had been there, a cold, calculating whisper in the back of her mind, and the fact that she had considered it made her feel dirty. Leaving him to die felt too much like pulling the trigger herself. It felt like becoming one of them. He seemed to understand what she was not saying. "Name's Eli," he said into the silence. "Clara," she replied. And that was all. They did not speak again for a long time. Eli drifted in and out of consciousness, his fevered breathing a ragged counterpoint to the storm's relentless assault on the barn. Clara sat by the fire, her shotgun resting across her lap. Every nerve stretched tight. She was alone with a stranger, a wanted man, while the world disappeared under a blanket of snow. The proximity was unnerving. In the small circle of firelight, they were the only two people alive in the universe. She could see the pulse beating in his throat, the way his chest rose and fell with each pained breath. He was vulnerable, completely at her mercy, and yet she felt just as exposed. He was a piece of the violent world she was trying to escape, brought right to her doorstep. To trust him was to invite disaster, but to abandon him was to lose the last, tattered piece of the person she had been before her father's death. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the darkness. The mare stamped a hoof impatiently. Outside, the snow fell heavier and heavier, burying the past and sealing their future, at least for this one night, together in the heart of the storm. Their silence was a living thing, thick with unspoken histories of loss and violence, weighted with a fragile, terrifying truce that neither of them had asked for, but both of them desperately needed. Morning came not with light, but with a subtle lessening of the dark. The world beyond the barn was a uniform, blinding white. The snow having fallen so deep and so relentlessly that it had buried every feature of the landscape. An unnerving silence pressed in from all sides, the howl of the wind having finally subsided, leaving a stillness that felt heavy and absolute. Eli was awake. He had been for some time, watching her from across the small, dying fire. His eyes, clear of fever's haze, were sharp and guarded. When Clara met his gaze, she saw the suspicion she expected. He was a cornered animal, and she was the stranger who had tended his wounds. In his world, kindness was a currency rarely spent without the expectation of something in return. "The storm has broken," she said, her voice flat. It was not an invitation to conversation, but a statement of fact. She rose and stretched, her joints protesting the cold and the hard-packed earth she had used for a bed. "You are still here," Eli observed, his voice raspy. He tried to push himself into a more upright position, a sharp intake of breath betraying the pain in his shoulder. "The snow is 5 feet deep in places. My horse cannot travel in this," she replied, kicking at the embers of the fire. "I would have been gone before you woke. Otherwise—" It was a lie, but a necessary one. Admitting she had stayed out of some fledgling sense of duty felt like a weakness she could not afford to show him. He watched her every move as she checked on her mare, murmuring softly to the animal and giving it a small portion of oats. He saw the way she moved, with a weary competence, a familiarity with hardship that spoke of a long and lonely road. She packed her meager belongings back into her saddlebag, the message clear. As soon as a path was clear, she would be gone. "Wait," he said, the word costing him visible effort. "Just one more day." Clara turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I am not running a hospital. You are a danger to me. The men who shot you could still be out there." "They are not," he said with certainty. "They would have tracked me here before the storm hit if they could have. They are holed up somewhere, same as us, or frozen dead. By the time they can ride again, I will be gone." He looked down at his bandaged shoulder, at his own uselessness. "I cannot travel like this. I will slow you down, I know it. But if you leave me, I will die here." The plea hung in the air between them. It was raw, stripped of pride. He was asking for his life. Clara looked away from him, toward the wall of white that blocked the barn doors. He was right. Leaving him now would be a death sentence, no different than if she put her colt to his head. And for all her hardness, for all the cold resolve she had cultivated to survive, she found she could not do it. She was haunted by one ghost. She had no desire to create another. "One day," she said, her voice sharp, "when the snow settles, you find your own way. I am not your guardian." A flicker of relief passed over his face, so faint she almost missed it. "Thank you," he whispered, The day passed in a strained, awkward silence. They were two wolves trapped in the same cage, wary and unwilling to show any vulnerability. Clara melted snow for water in a small, battered tin pot. She shared her jerky, slicing it into thin strips with her knife. They ate on opposite sides of the resurrected fire, the small flames a fragile truce line between them. The barn, their prison and their sanctuary, groaned periodically under the immense weight of the snow on its roof. The sound was a constant reminder of how precarious their shelter was, how easily the indifferent world outside could crush them. To fill the suffocating silence, they began to speak. Their words were like small stones dropped into a deep well, hesitant and spare. They did not share stories so much as they confessed wounds. "My PA used to say the only thing a rich man fears is another rich man," Clara said, staring into the fire. "He said the law was just a fence they built to keep the rest of us out of their pastures." Eli nodded slowly, chewing a piece of jerky. "Silas Croft, the man I worked for, he owned the sheriff, paid his wages. They said, when a hand got hurt, Croft would dock his pay for the time he missed. Said it was the man's own fault for being clumsy." He paused, his gaze distant. He liked to see people break. That quiet statement seemed to trigger something in him. The barn faded away, and for a moment, he was back in the heat and dust of Croft's ranch. He remembered the boy, Billy. He could not have been more than 17, all elbows and apologies, with a desperation to please that Croft seemed to find particularly amusing. Billy had come west to send money back to his mother, a story so common it was practically a uniform. Croft had taken a dislike to him from the start. It was the boy's hope that offended him, that small, fragile light that had not yet been extinguished. The abuse was a slow poison, a saddle tampered with, so the boy would be thrown, a day's wages docked because his work was supposedly shoddy, constant, grinding verbal abuse in front of the other hands, designed to strip him of his dignity. Eli had watched it all, his gut twisting into a cold knot. He had told himself it was not his fight. He was just passing through, earning a stake before moving on. Getting involved was a fool's game. Then came the day with the watering trough. Croft had accused Billy of letting it run dry, though Eli knew for a fact the boy had filled it that morning. It was just an excuse. Croft stood over him, his face flushed with cheap whiskey and power, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "You are a lazy, worthless stray," Croft had said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Maybe you need a lesson in responsibility." Billy, trembling, had simply stared at the ground. "I filled it, sir. I swear I did." "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" Eli had stepped forward then. He had not planned it. The words just came out, quiet and even. "He filled it, Mr. Croft. I saw him." Croft had turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. He hated Eli's silence, his refusal to be baited or broken like the others. Well, the quiet man speaks. Sticking up for the runt of the litter, are we?" "Just telling what I saw," Eli said, keeping his hands loose at his sides. "You are finished here," Croft spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "Get your things and ride out. You are both fired." He then turned back to Billy. "But you are not leaving before you learn your place." Croft had drawn his belt, the heavy silver buckle glinting in the sun. It was then that something in Eli snapped. He had seen this before, on other ranches, in other dusty towns, men with power taking what they wanted from those who had none. He had always looked away. Not this time. "Leave the boy alone, Croft," Eli said, his voice low but carrying a new, hard edge. Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what? You gonna stop me?" His hand dropped from his belt to his gun. "I make the rules here." He drew the pistol. It was a clumsy, drunken movement, but the intent was clear. Eli's reaction was pure instinct, honed by a life where a moment's hesitation meant death. His own gun was in his hand, barking once, the sound shockingly loud in the still afternoon air. Silas Croft stared at him, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he crumpled into the dust he had lorded over. The other ranch hands just stood there, their faces a mixture of terror and something that looked horribly like gratitude. Eli had not waited. He had grabbed his horse and ridden, the word murderer already chasing him across the plains. He blinked, the memory receding, leaving the cold reality of the barn. Clara was watching him, her expression unreadable. He felt a sudden, sharp need to make her understand. He was going to beat the boy senseless, or worse, Eli said quietly. He pulled on me first. I had no choice. Clara said nothing for a long time. She just poked at the fire with a stick. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with an emotion she tried to hide. Choice, she said, the word brittle. Sometimes it feels like you never have one at all. She looked at her own hands, at the calloused palms and scarred knuckles. They were her father's hands. In a way, he had been a gentleman, but his work had made him hard. He believed in fairness, in a man's word. It was a faith that had gotten him killed. Her own memory rose unbidden, as sharp and painful as the day it was made. It was not a dusty ranch yard, but a wide green valley in the shadow of the mountains. A creek ran through it, and the grazing was good, too good. A man named Jed, the foreman for a rival ranch, had decided that valley belonged to his boss. Her father, Thomas, had papers, a deed signed and sealed, but papers were only as strong as the law that backed them, and the law was a long way off. You are trespassing, Jed, her father had said, his voice calm, though Clara, watching from a hiding place in the rocks 100 yards away, could see the tension in his shoulders. He had told her to stay put, to stay out of sight. Just a discussion between men, he had said, trying to reassure her. This ain't your land no more, old man, Jed sneered. He had 2 other men with him, both carrying rifles. You got till sundown to move your cattle out. I have a deed, her father insisted, holding up the paper as if it were a shield. Jed had laughed. I got this, he said, patting the rifle in his hands. This is the only deed that matters out here. Her father had stood his ground. He was a stubborn man, proud and unbending. You will not steal my family's future. Jed, I will not let you. Clara had watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Her own rifle was leaning against the rock beside her. She could have made a difference. A shot in the air, a distraction, something, but her father's words, "Stay put, Clara," were a chain holding her down. She was terrified. She was a girl of 19, and she was watching the world prepare to end. Jed had tired of talking. He had raised his rifle. Last chance, Thomas. Her father had not backed down. He had taken a step forward. This is my land. The shot was an obscene crack that echoed through the peaceful valley. Her father fell, not like in stories, but in a clumsy, awkward heap, as if his legs had simply forgotten how to hold him. Jed and his men had not even looked back. They had mounted their horses and ridden off, leaving him lying in the grass. Clara had not moved for an hour. She just stayed frozen in the rocks, the rifle heavy and useless in her hands. By the time she had scrambled down to him, he was gone. The guilt had been her shadow ever since. She had survived because she had been a coward. She had obeyed. She had done nothing. That single moment of inaction had burned away her youth and left this hard, running creature in its place. The barn groaned again, louder this time, a deep, protracted sound of timber under strain. The snow was a physical presence, a weight that threatened to smother them. Their isolation was complete, a world of 2 people haunted by the ghosts of their past decisions. Night fell. The storm returned with a new fury, the wind screaming around the corners of the barn. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour, a new sound intruded, a crunch of boots in the snow, A low, gruff voice. Clara was on her feet in an instant, shotgun in hand. "Get down!" she hissed at Eli, her voice a blade of sound. "In the hay, now!" Eli, understanding immediately, did not argue. He crawled, biting back a groan of pain, and burrowed into a loose pile of hay in a dark corner, pulling the dusty stalks over himself. Clara moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Anyone in there?" a voice called out. "We saw your light, just looking for shelter from this devil's wind." There were at least 2 of them. Bandits, drifters, men who would take what they wanted. She had a choice. Stay silent and hope they moved on, or answer and try to control the situation. Silence was a gamble. It might make them suspicious. She took a deep breath and pulled the heavy bar from the door, opening it just a crack. 3 men stood there, hulking shapes against the swirling snow, their faces obscured by scarves and low-brimmed hats. "Just me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, pitching it to sound like a lone, weary woman. "I have no room." The largest of the 3 men pushed the door open farther, forcing her to step back. He grinned, revealing a row of yellow, broken teeth. "Looks like plenty of room to us. Ma'am?" He and his companions shuffled inside, bringing the biting cold with them. They looked around the barn, their eyes taking in every detail. Their gaze lingered on her mare. "That is a fine-looking horse," the leader said, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "Too fine for a woman on her own." "She is not for sale," Clara said, her hand tightening on the shotgun she held partially concealed behind her back. "We are not looking to buy," another of the men chuckled, a nasty, wheezing sound. He took a step toward the horse. "Get away from her," Clara ordered, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. She brought the shotgun around, the twin barrels pointing at the man's chest. The leader's grin vanished. Now. No need for that. We are just cold travelers." But his eyes were hard, and he did not look away from the gun. The air was thick with violence waiting to happen. She was 1 woman against 3 men. The odds were not in her favor. Just as the leader took a half-step forward, a new voice cut through the tension. "I would do as she says." The men spun around. Eli was standing in the shadows by the barn entrance, leaning heavily against a post. He was pale as a ghost, sweat beading on his forehead, but he held Clara's rifle with a steady grip. He looked like death warmed over, but the rifle in his hands looked deadly serious. The bandits were startled, their confidence shaken. They had planned on overpowering a lone woman, not facing a man with a rifle, no matter how wounded he looked. Eli did not aim at any of them. He simply raised the rifle and fired. The explosion was deafening inside the barn. The bullet tore through the open doorway and buried itself in a snowdrift outside. The message was unmistakable. The leader held up his hands. All right. We are leaving. No trouble here." They backed out of the barn slowly, their eyes darting between Clara's shotgun and Eli's rifle. They vanished into the blizzard as quickly as they had appeared. Clara slammed the heavy door shut and barred it, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She turned to find Eli slumping against the post, the rifle slipping from his grasp. She rushed to his side, catching him before he fell. He was breathing in ragged gasps, the effort having cost him dearly. "You fool," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You should have stayed hidden." He looked up at her, a faint, tired smile on his lips. "And let them take your horse?" She helped him back to the fire, the tension between them dissolving into something new, something fragile. The fear they had shared had burned away the distrust, leaving a thin layer of gratitude in its place. He had risked himself for her. He settled by the fire, exhausted. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not empty, but filled with the unspoken reality of what had just passed between them. "Thank you," he said after a long while, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Clara knelt beside him, checking the bandage on his shoulder. It was clean. The wound had not reopened. Her movements were gentle. She looked at his face, pale and drawn in the firelight. Without thinking, she reached out her good hand and rested it on his uninjured shoulder. The touch was tentative, uncertain, the way a person might touch something they were afraid of breaking. The wool of his coat was coarse beneath her palm, but underneath it, she could feel the solid, living warmth of him. It was a strange and foreign feeling, this simple human contact. It was like remembering a language she had long forgotten how to speak. The sun rose on a world remade. For 3 days the storm had raged, a blind fury of wind and snow. But the fourth dawned in a profound and breathless silence. Light, brilliant and unforgiving, poured over the plains, reflecting off a pristine, unbroken sea of white. The abandoned barn stood like a lonely island, its roof sagging under a massive blanket of snow. Inside, the fragile truce held. The shared threat of the bandits, followed by the shared ordeal of the storm, had changed the air between them. The sharp edges of their distrust had been worn smooth, replaced by a quiet, functional alliance. Eli's wound was healing cleanly, though his face was still pale and drawn. He was weak, but the fever had broken. As Clara tended to the horses, Eli watched her, a new understanding in his eyes. He had seen her stand against 3 men with nothing but a shotgun and a spine of steel. He had seen the quiet competence with which she survived. She was not the helpless creature the bandits had assumed. She was a fighter, scarred and solitary, but unbroken. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Once a thaw sets in, this roof might come down, and my trail will be easy to follow for anyone looking." Clara nodded, not looking at him. "I know. As soon as the horses can get through, I am riding north." "North is nothing but mountains and misery this time of year," he cautioned. "There is a settlement, a mining camp called Silver Creek, 2 days west of here. It is rough, but you can get supplies, disappear for a while." He paused, and the offer came out, hesitant but sincere. "I can guide you. I know the pass." She stopped her work and finally turned to face him. The offer was a complication she did not want. Traveling with a wanted man was a risk, but he was right. She was running blind, and the mountains in winter were a death sentence for the unprepared. Her own survival was a matter of cold calculation, and the math, however unpleasant, was clear. "You are in no shape to ride," she stated flatly. "I am in better shape to ride than I am to be left here," he countered. "We help each other. I get you to Silver Creek, and we part ways. No questions, no debts." It was a sensible arrangement, a partnership of convenience. She gave a short, sharp nod. "Fine, but you slow me down. I leave you behind." It took them half a day of grueling labor to clear a path from the barn. Using broken planks of wood as makeshift shovels, they worked in silence, a team born of necessity. The rhythmic scrape of wood on snow, the only sound in the vast stillness. By midday, a narrow channel led out from the barn, a dark scar on the perfect white. They set out under a sky of piercing, metallic blue. The journey he had promised would take 2 days in good weather became a brutal, protracted ordeal. The mountain pass was a landscape of raw and terrible beauty. Immense peaks of rock and ice clawed at the sky, and the world was reduced to shades of white, gray, and blue. The cold was a living entity, a predator that gnawed at them through their layers of wool and leather. The air grew thin, and every breath was a conscious effort, a sharp, cold pain in their lungs. Their supplies dwindled with alarming speed. The jerky and hardtack were gone by the second day, replaced by a grim diet of pine needle tea and a single, scrawny rabbit Clara managed to bring down with a well-aimed shot. Hunger became a constant, hollow ache in their bellies. It was the hardship that wore away their final defenses. Misery, they discovered, was a great equalizer. It stripped away pride and pretense, leaving only the raw, shared struggle for life. They stopped speaking in clipped, functional sentences and started to truly talk. Their words were no longer just about the path ahead or the dwindling food, but about the lives they had left behind. Small, fragmented memories offered up like precious gifts. Eli spoke of his childhood on a small farm in Ohio, a place so green and gentle it seemed like a dream to him now. He told her about his father, a man who could fix anything with his hands but could not save his farm from the railroad that bought up all the land. Clara, in turn, spoke of her mother, who had died of fever when she was a girl, and of her own father's quiet pride in the small herd of cattle he had built from nothing. They were careful not to touch the wounds that had sent them running, the murders, real or accused, but they circled the edges, sharing the shape of the lives that had been stolen from them. The journey was hardest on Eli. His body, still mending, could not stand the strain. By the third night, as they made camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang, his strength gave out. A fever returned, less severe than before, but leaving him weak and shivering uncontrollably. Clara worked without a word, her movements filled with a tenderness that would have shocked her a week ago. She settled him by the fire, piling their blankets over him. She melted snow and boiled the last of the rabbit bones into a thin, weak broth, blowing on each spoonful before lifting it to his chapped lips. He was too weak to protest, his usual pride replaced by a weary gratitude. She cleaned and redressed his wound by the flickering firelight. Her touch was gentle, her hands, once so calloused and hard, moving with a surprising delicacy. He watched her, his eyes dark and heavy in his pale face. The firelight softened the harsh lines of her features, revealing a weary beauty he had not noticed before. "You should not have to do this," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "No," she agreed softly, tying off the new bandage. "I should not, but here we are." Their eyes met and held. The space between them, once a chasm of distrust, had become something else entirely. It was charged with a current of unspoken understanding, a recognition of the other's pain, of their shared loneliness. In his gaze, she did not see a murderer or a threat, but a man as lost and broken as she was. And in her eyes, he saw not a cold, hard survivor, but a woman whose compassion had been buried, not destroyed. On the fourth night, the fever broke again. Eli was weak but lucid, and the intimacy of the previous night lingered in the quiet space between them. They sat huddled by the fire, the vast, star-dusted sky arching over them, the silence of the mountains absolute. They were a tiny speck of warmth and life in an immense, frozen world. Clara stared into the flames, a strange mood upon her. The journey, the proximity to death, the simple act of caring for another human being, it had all unlocked something within her. "I used to believe love was a luxury," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the night air. "Something only rich folks with soft hands and warm houses could afford. For the rest of us, it was just a weakness. One more thing for the world to take from you." She thought of her father, of how his love for his land, for his daughter's future, had made him stubborn and unbending, and how it had ultimately gotten him killed. Eli was silent for a long time, watching her face in the firelight. "I do not think that is true," he said finally, his voice gentle. "I think love is for the ones who survive. It is the reward for making it through all the hardship. It is the thing you find when you are done just trying to live, and you are ready to start living for something." He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "It is for people like us, Clara, the ones who have lost everything else." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were a denial of the bitter creed she had lived by for so long. They offered a hope she had not dared to feel, a warmth she had forgotten existed. The frozen, guarded thing inside her chest seemed to crack. Tears she did not know she still possessed pricked at the back of her eyes. She did not know who moved first. It did not matter. One moment they were sitting on opposite sides of the fire, and the next he had shifted closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. His skin was cold, but his touch was a fire that spread through her veins. She leaned into his hand, a silent, weary surrender. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate hunger. It was something quieter, deeper. It was a kiss of profound and sorrowful understanding. It tasted of campfire smoke and cold air and shared loneliness. It was an acknowledgement of all the pain that lay between them and a fleeting, desperate prayer for a moment of peace. For Clara, it felt like laying down a weapon she had been carrying for a very long time. She closed her eyes and, for one single, fragile moment, she was not running. She was home. The next morning, the world felt different. The air was still cold, but it did not seem as sharp. A fragile hope had been kindled in the darkness, and the journey ahead felt less like a flight and more like a pilgrimage toward some shared, unspoken destination. While Eli rested, Clara took her rifle and went to check a small snare she had set the evening before. As she walked through the silent, snow-dusted pines, a scrap of paper caught her eye. It was tacked to the trunk of a tree, flapping in the slight breeze, a stark, black and white intrusion on the natural world. It was a wanted poster. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She had seen dozens of these in her travels, tacked to the walls of post offices and saloons. She approached it with a sense of dread. The drawing was crude, a caricature of sharp angles and dark, sunken eyes, but it was unmistakably him. The face was gaunter, harder, but the set of the jaw, the line of his brow, it was Eli. Below the drawing, the words were stark and brutal. Wanted, Elijah L. Vance, for the murder of rancher Silas Croft, known to be armed and dangerous. And at the bottom, the number that stole the air from her lungs. $500 reward. $500. The sum echoed in the silent forest. It was a fortune. It was more money than her father had seen in his entire life. It was enough to buy a small farm, a few head of cattle, enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old one, enough to stop running. Forever. It was a key to a door she thought would always be locked. The kiss by the fire, his gentle words, the warmth of his hand on her face, it all curdled in her stomach. Had it all been a lie? A clever manipulation by a desperate man trying to secure his own survival? He knew she was alone, desperate. Had he seen her as an easy mark, a means to an end? The fragile trust she had painstakingly built shattered into 1,000 pieces, leaving behind the cold, familiar sting of betrayal. She tore the poster from the tree, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it. She crumpled it into a ball and stalked back to the camp, her heart a block of ice in her chest. He was sitting up by the fire, trying to mend a tear in his coat. He looked up as she approached and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that now looked like a mask to her. "Any luck with the snare?" he asked. She did not answer. She walked until she was standing over him, and then she drew her Colt. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnervously loud in the morning quiet. Eli's smile vanished. He looked from her face, a twisted mask of pain and fury, down to the gun pointed at his heart, and then to the crumpled poster in her other hand. A look of weary resignation settled over his features. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting this all along. "Clara," he started, his voice soft. "Do not," she hissed, the word trembling on her lips. "Do not say my name." The gun shook in her hand. A part of her, the cold, practical part that had kept her alive, was screaming at her to pull the trigger. $500. A new life. The man was a murderer. It was justice. But the woman who had held his head while he shivered with fever, the woman who had surrendered to a moment of impossible tenderness by a lonely campfire, could not make her finger obey. Eli slowly raised his hands, not in fear, but in a gesture of peace. He did not plead. He did not make excuses. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound and terrible sadness. "Do what you need to live." "Clara," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I meant what I said. Survival is all that matters. If this is what it takes for you to survive, then you do it." His words struck her harder than a physical blow. He was giving her permission. He was offering her his life in exchange for hers, validating the brutal calculus she had just been making in her own mind. And in that selfless, heartbreaking moment, she knew, with sickening certainty, that he had not been lying to her. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, ragged sound of a heart breaking. The gun felt impossibly heavy. She could not do it. She could not become the thing she hated. She could not buy her life with his death. With a cry of anguish, she lowered the gun. The barrel pointed down at the snow, a dead weight in her hand. She stared at him, her vision blurred with unshed tears, the wanted poster a leaden ball in her fist. The fire between them flickered and hissed, consuming the wood with a quiet hunger. The warmth it gave off could not reach the sudden, icy chasm that had opened up between them. They were back where they started. Two strangers on opposite sides of a fire. Only now the silence was not one of distrust, but of a devastating, impossible truth. The journey from the mountain pass was a silent, punishing affair. The fragile bridge of words and warmth they had built by the campfire had been shattered by the wanted poster, and a chasm of unspoken things now lay between them. They moved like ghosts through the snow-dusted foothills, their gazes fixed on the trail ahead, their silence a heavy blanket smothering the landscape. Clara rode with a rigid straightness in her spine, the weight of her Colt revolver a cold, constant reminder of the choice she had made. Eli, riding beside her, seemed to have shrunk into himself, his face a mask of weary acceptance. He had offered her his life, and in refusing to take it, she had bound herself to him in a way that felt more permanent and terrifying than any promise. After 2 days of this tense, wordless travel, they saw it. Silver Creek was not so much a town as a raw wound carved into the side of a mountain, a chaotic jumble of crude tents, log lean-tos, and a few rough-hewn buildings clung to the muddy slopes, all of it stained with the grime of coal dust and desperation. The air was thick with the clamor of hammers on steel, the braying of mules, and the rough shouts of men who had come from all corners of the earth to tear a living from the rock. It was a place without comfort, but it offered a temporary anonymity that was more valuable than any warmth. They entered the camp not as partners, but as two separate, solitary figures. Clara's first stop was the livery, a dilapidated shed that smelled of wet hay and manure. An old man with a suspicious squint and a jaw full of chewing tobacco looked her and the mare over. "Fine animal," he grunted, spitting a brown stream near her boots. "What do you want for her?" Clara's hand tightened on the reins. This horse was her last tangible link to the life she had lost, her only means of a swift escape. Selling her felt like cutting off a limb, but then she looked over at Eli, who was leaning against a post, his face pale with exhaustion, his hand unconsciously pressed to his wounded shoulder. The $500 reward from the poster flashed in her mind. The price of a man's life. This was the price of keeping him alive. $30, she said, her voice hard, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The man laughed. 20, and that is me being generous. They bartered, their voices sharp and clipped, a familiar dance of commerce. They settled on $25. Clara took the worn banknotes, the paper feeling flimsy and insignificant in her palm. She ran her hand down the mare's neck one last time, whispering a goodbye that only the horse could hear, before turning her back and walking away without a second glance. She could not afford to look back. The money bought them a world of small miracles. At the camp's general store, a large tent filled with barrels of flour, bolts of cloth, and shelves of patent medicines, she bought clean bandages, a small bottle of laudanum for the pain she knew Eli was hiding, and real food, bacon, beans, and a small sack of coffee. The smell of the coffee alone was enough to make her feel almost human again. As the storekeeper weighed out the beans, two grimy miners were talking by the stove, their voices low but carrying in the small space. "Heard Sheriff Miller and his posse passed through Bell's Fork yesterday," one of them said, warming his hands. "Riding hard. Word is they are heading north." "Still chasing that cowboy who shot old man Croft?" the other asked. "That is the one. A cold-blooded murderer. They say $500 on his head. For that kind of money, I would hunt the devil himself." Clara's blood ran cold. She kept her back to them, her shoulders hunched, praying they could not see the sudden fear on her face. A posse. They were not just a vague threat anymore. They had a name, a direction. They were close. She paid for her goods, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked the packages into her saddlebag, and hurried out of the tent, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Eli resting near the livery, his eyes closed. "We are leaving," she said, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "Now?" He opened his eyes, seeing the panic in hers. "What is it?" "A posse is coming. They are hunting you," she said, her words tumbling out. "We have to go. We will travel at night." He did not argue. He saw the grim set of her jaw and pushed himself to his feet. They bought a second horse, a sturdy but ugly mule of an animal. With the last of her money, it was a poor replacement for her mare, but it was all they could afford. As dusk settled over the grimy camp, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, they rode out, two shadows slipping into the dark, rolling hills to the west. The night was cold and moonless, the trail a treacherous ribbon of darkness. They moved slowly, letting the horses pick their way over the rocky ground. The fear of pursuit was a palpable thing between them, a third rider in their small party. It was that fear, that shared proximity to the end, that finally broke the silence. "You never told me the whole story," Clara said, her voice quiet in the vast darkness. Eli was silent for a long moment, the only sound the clink of a horseshoe on stone. "I told you what you needed to know," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "He drew on me." "The miners, they called you a murderer," she pressed, needing to understand, needing to justify the path she had chosen. "A cold-blooded one. But you are not that. I know you are not." He sighed, a long, ragged sound. "It was not just about the boy. Billy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There was a girl. Her name was Sarah. She worked in the kitchen at the ranch house. Young, scared. Croft. He had his eye on her." He spoke of it in clipped, pained sentences. He told her how Silas Croft, a man who saw people as possessions, had begun to torment the serving girl. It started with small cruelties, a harsh word, a hand that lingered too long on her arm. The other hands saw it. They all saw it. But they were poor men with families to feed. And Croft was the man who signed their pay. So they looked away. They learned to be blind. "I saw her crying one day, behind the smokehouse," Eli continued, his voice rough with the memory. He had told her that if she was not accommodating to him, he would see to it that her younger brother, who worked in the stables, had a terrible accident. She was trapped. Clara felt a familiar, sickening guilt twist in her gut. She knew that feeling of being trapped, of seeing a terrible injustice and being powerless to stop it. "The night it happened," Eli said, "I was checking on a sick horse in the main barn. I heard a noise from the tack room. Sarah was in there, crying. Croft had her cornered. He was drunk, and he was not asking anymore." Eli's voice hardened. "He was tearing at her dress. She was fighting, but she was small. I shouted at him. I told him to let her go." Eli stopped, the memory so vivid he could almost smell the hay and the whiskey on Croft's breath. "He turned on me. He was furious that I had interfered, that I had seen his true face. He told me I was a dead man for getting in his way. And then he pulled his gun. The girl screamed. "I did not even think. I just drew and fired." The story settled in the darkness around Clara, stark and horrifyingly clear. Eli had not killed for money or for land or for pride. He had killed to save someone. He had done the one thing no one else had the courage to do. He had stepped in. And Clara, in her own moment of crisis, had not. She had hidden in the rocks while her father faced down a man with a rifle. She had stayed safe. She had survived. The guilt she had carried for so long deepened into a profound and burning shame. She was no better than the ranch hands who had looked the other way. In her silence, in her fear, she had been complicit in the cruelty of the world. She had let a good man die because she was afraid. Eli had risked everything to save a girl he barely knew. They rode on, the weight of his confession and her shame filling the night. They were just cresting a small ridge, a frozen creek gleaming faintly below them, when the world exploded in a flash of orange and a deafening crack. A bullet whizzed past Clara's head, so close she felt its heat. The posse! They had found them! Another shot rang out, and Eli cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He slumped forward, his legs suddenly useless. "Go!" he yelled, clutching at his thigh where a dark stain was already spreading. "Clara, ride!" But she was not listening. The girl who had hidden in the rocks was gone. In her place was a woman fueled by a righteous, incandescent rage. Rage at the posse hunting them like animals. Rage at the world that had made them outlaws. And most of all, rage at her own past cowardice. She yanked her rifle from its scabbard, leaped from her horse, and pulled Eli down behind the meager cover of a rocky outcrop. "Stay down!" she screamed at him. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the darkness across the creek. Clara raised her rifle and fired back. She was not aiming to kill. She was aiming to create chaos, to make them afraid, to show them that their prey had teeth. She fired wildly, levering a new round into the chamber, firing again and again. The explosions echoing across the frozen landscape. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around her, sending chips of stone stinging against her cheek. She did not care. She was a fury, a banshee, protecting the wounded man beside her with a ferocity that stunned them all, including herself. Under the cover of her relentless fire, she grabbed Eli's arm. "Can you walk?" "No," he gasped, his face slick with sweat. "Then you will crawl," she ordered, dragging him away from the rocks and into the deeper shadows of the woods that lined the creek. They scrambled into the darkness, crashing through thorny undergrowth, the shouts of the posse fading behind them. They did not stop until the sounds of pursuit were gone, replaced by the rasp of their own breathing and the frantic beating of their hearts. They found it by sheer, dumb luck. A burned-out cabin, a skeletal ruin of blackened timbers and a collapsed roof, its stone chimney standing like a lonely tombstone against the night sky. It offered little protection from the cold, but it was a hiding place. Eli collapsed just inside the threshold, his breathing shallow, a pool of blood forming beneath his wounded leg. The fire of battle had left Clara, replaced by a cold, frantic fear. He was losing too much blood. Working by the faint starlight filtering through the ruined roof, she pulled out her knife. Without a moment's hesitation, she sliced a long, wide strip from the bottom of her wool skirt. The fabric was coarse and heavy, but it was all she had. Her hands trembled as she wrapped the makeshift bandage around his thigh, pulling it as tight as she could to staunch the bleeding. He was shivering, his skin clammy. His eyes, when they met hers, were clouded with pain and resignation. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a thread. "You have to go, before dawn. They will find this place. Take the horse. Save yourself." "Be quiet," she commanded, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I mean it," he insisted, his hand weakly gripping her arm. "You have done enough, more than enough. Do not let them take you, too." She stopped her work and looked down at him, at this good, broken man who had tried to do the right thing in a world that punished such impulses. She saw his sacrifice, and she saw the ghost of her father, and she saw the long, empty road of her own survival, and she knew she could not run anymore. Running was a kind of death, too. She leaned down, putting her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. Her hands were shaking, but her gaze was steady. "You did not kill for hate," she said, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. "You killed because someone had to stop him. Someone had to stand up. You stood up." His eyes widened slightly. Seeing the fierce, protective light in hers, he saw that she understood, that she believed him. The night was freezing, the wind whistling through the burned-out timbers of their pathetic shelter. He was shivering violently now, the shock and blood loss taking their toll. She built a tiny, smokeless fire in the stone hearth, using dry wood she found in a sheltered corner. It was a pitifully small flame, but it was a bastion against the encroaching darkness. She lay down beside him on the cold, hard earth, pulling the last of their blankets over them both. He was still shivering, his teeth chattering. It was not enough. Without a word, she moved closer, wrapping her arms around him, pressing her body against his, trying to lend him her own warmth, her own life. He was tense at first, surprised by the intimacy of the gesture. Then, with a shuddering sigh, he relaxed into her hold, his head resting against her shoulder. The world outside, with its posses and its cruelty and its cold, hard justice ceased to exist. There was only the flickering firelight, the whisper of the wind, and the shared, desperate warmth of two scarred souls clinging to each other in the ruins. It was an apology for ever doubting him. It was a rebellion against the fate that was hunting them. It was, in the deepest, quietest part of her heart, an act of love. The fire was a fragile, beating heart in the chest of the ruined cabin. Outside, a gentle snow had begun to fall, each flake a whisper against the blackened timbers, muffling the world and drawing the boundaries of their existence down to the small circle of flickering light. Inside that circle, there was no posse, no wanted poster, no past filled with blood and regret. There was only the warmth of the flames and the shared heat of their bodies pressed together against the unforgiving cold. Clara held him, feeling the violent shivers that racked his body slowly subside as her own warmth seeped into him. His head rested in the crook of her neck, his breathing a shallow, ragged rhythm against her skin. She could feel the unsteady beat of his heart through the coarse wool of his shirt. It was a fragile, stubborn drum, a testament to the life that refused to be extinguished. This closeness was something new, something terrifying and profound. It was an intimacy born not of passion, but of a shared sentence of death, a communion of two souls who had been stripped of everything but each other. She looked at his face in the firelight, the sharp lines softened by sleep and pain. She saw the boy from Ohio who had lost his family's farm, the quiet man who had stood up for a frightened girl, the outlaw who had offered her his life so that she might live. The hardened shell around her own heart, a thing she had nurtured for years as a form of armor, had been shattered. In its place was a painful, aching vulnerability. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He did not seem surprised to find himself in her arms. He simply looked at her, his gaze clear and deep, and in that look, a universe of unspoken things was exchanged. It was an acknowledgement that this night, this single stolen moment of peace, was likely all they would ever have. The world outside would return with the dawn, relentless and cruel. But for now, in the heart of the ruins, they were safe. He shifted slightly, his hand finding hers, his fingers, though weak, lacing through her own. The contact was a silent vow, a recognition of their shared fate. A rebellion rose in her, fierce and sudden. It was a rebellion against the years of running, of surviving but not living. A rebellion against the world that had declared them both disposable. She had this one night, and she would claim it. She would not let it pass in silence. She leaned closer, her lips brushing against his ear. her breath a warm cloud in the cold air. "I will let you ride with me," she whispered, the words a confession she had never thought she would make. She felt him tense slightly. Listening, she added the heartbreaking truth, the defiance that sealed their pact. But only tonight. It was not a promise of a future. It was a claiming of the present. It was her way of saying, "I love you," in the only language she had left, the language of survival, of defiance, of a single, perfect moment stolen from the jaws of fate. A lone tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek and fell onto his. A silent, salty offering. He squeezed her hand, a pressure so faint it was barely there, but she felt it down to her soul. And in the quiet dark, with the snow falling like a benediction, they slept. Dawn broke, gray and unforgiving. The first thing Eli registered was the cold. It was a deep, biting chill that had settled into his bones. The fire was nothing more than a pile of pale, gray ash. The blanket was still covering him, but the warmth beside him was gone. He was alone. He pushed himself up, his head swimming with dizziness, his wounded legs screaming in protest. "Clara?" he called out, his voice a raw croak in the empty cabin. The only answer was the mournful sigh of the wind through the broken timbers. A cold dread, heavier and more chilling than the morning air, settled in his gut. She had left him. The thought was a physical blow. She had saved him, held him, spoken words of impossible tenderness, and then she had vanished. It made no sense. He scanned the small, ruined space, his eyes desperate. Then he saw it. Lying on a flat stone beside the dead fire was her father's revolver. It was an old Colt, the wooden grip worn smooth from years of use. The bluing faded. It was her only other constant companion besides her horse, a talisman connecting her to the man she had lost. Beside it was a folded scrap of paper, weighted down with a small, sharp stone. With a trembling hand, Eli reached for the note. He unfolded it. The writing was a rough, hasty scrawl, the pencil strokes dark and urgent. 3 days, Laredo, south border, C. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. She had not abandoned him. This was a plan, a rendezvous, a chance. But why had she left? Why leave him her gun? He looked around again and realized the second horse, the ugly mule they had bought, was also gone. His own horse was still tethered just outside, patiently waiting. She had left him her father's gun and his own mount. She had taken the slower animal for herself. And then he understood. The cold dread returned, tenfold. But this time it was not for himself. She had not run from him. She was running for him. She was drawing them away, leading the posse on a false trail to give him time to escape. A wave of guilt and love so powerful it nearly choked him washed over Eli. She was out there, alone, with a posse on her heels. And he was lying here, useless. He would not let her sacrifice be in vain. He would not let her face them alone. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain in his leg, he began to move. Every motion was agony. He tore another strip from his own shirt and bound his leg even tighter, the pressure a dull, sickening throb. He checked the revolver she had left him. It was fully loaded. He slid it into his empty holster, the familiar weight a small, grim comfort. He ate the last of the beans cold from the can, forcing the food down, knowing he would need every ounce of strength he could muster. Within the hour, he was in the saddle, his face a pale, sweat-sheened mask of determination. He turned his horse and began the slow, painful process of tracking her. The perspective shifted to Clara. The wind was a physical force, a wall of razor-sharp air that tore at her face and stole the breath from her lungs. She pushed the mule onward, its clumsy gait a frustratingly slow rhythm against the urgent pounding of her heart. She had ridden hard for the first few hours, deliberately leaving a clear, obvious trail in the fresh snow. She wanted them to follow her. She needed them to. Every mile she put between them and the burned-out cabin was another minute of life she was buying for Eli. She did not allow herself to think about him. If she thought about the feel of his hand in hers, of the quiet desperation in his eyes, she would lose her nerve. She focused only on the task ahead. Ride, endure, lure them away, survive. It was the mantra that had gotten her this far, but now it had a new purpose. It was not just for herself anymore. By late afternoon, she heard them, the distant, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats behind her. They were coming. A thrill of cold terror shot through her, but it was followed by a grim sense of satisfaction. Her plan was working. She urged the mule faster, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead, looking for an advantage, a place to make a stand. She found it where the land dropped away into a deep, narrow ravine. A single treacherous trail snaked down one side and up the other. But spanning a narrow section of the chasm was a massive, dead pine tree that had fallen years ago. Its trunk as wide as a man was tall. It was a natural bridge, but it was also a choke point. She dismounted, her limbs stiff and aching with cold. She could hear their shouts now, closer, echoing in the clear, frigid air. They had seen her. She had minutes, at most. Working with frantic speed, she pulled a ball of oilcloth and her flint and steel from her saddlebag. She gathered dry twigs and pine needles, stuffing them into the dry, resinous cracks of the fallen tree. Her fingers were numb, clumsy, but her mind was sharp. She struck the flint, once, twice. A spark caught. She blew on it gently, coaxing it to life, feeding the tiny flame with more tinder. The posse riders appeared at the edge of the trees, a line of dark, implacable figures. The leader, a man with a thick gray beard and cold eyes, raised his hand, and they slowed to a halt. Seeing her trapped against the ravine, "It is over, girl," he shouted, his voice booming across the distance. "Give it up. Where is he?" Clara did not answer. The flame in her hands had caught, licking at the dry bark of the ancient pine. She pushed the burning tinder deep into the heartwood of the log, then added the entire oilcloth. The treated fabric caught with a whoosh, and the fire roared to life, hungry and eager. "Last chance," the sheriff yelled. Clara scrambled across the log, the heat scorching her back. As soon as she reached the other side, she did not look back. She leaped onto her mule and galloped away, just as the flames engulfed the entire log, sending a thick, billowing column of black smoke into the pristine blue sky. She had bought herself more time. Hours later, Eli reached the ravine. The fire had mostly died down, but the great log was a smoldering, impassable ruin of charcoal and ash. He saw the tracks, the single trail of the mule on one side, and the churned, frustrated tracks of a dozen horses on the other. They had turned back, likely to find another way across. His gaze swept the ground, and his heart seized. There, on a patch of snow near where she must have stood, was a small, dark stain. Blood. He dismounted, his legs screaming in protest, and knelt. It was not much, just a few frozen droplets, but it was undeniably blood. Had she been hit? Had one of their shots found its mark before she escaped? The uncertainty was a fresh torture. He looked south at the lone set of hoofprints fading into the distance. She was wounded, alone, and still being hunted. His exhaustion, his pain, it all vanished, burned away by a clean, pure flame of purpose. He would find her. He had to. The story split then, into two desperate journeys under the same cold sky. From Clara's perspective, there was only the gnawing exhaustion, the constant looking over her shoulder, the dull ache in her arm where a stray bullet had grazed her. She was a lure, a phantom leading the dogs of the law on a chase across a barren landscape, her energy draining with every mile. From Eli's perspective, there was only the trail. He rode with a singular, pain-fueled focus, his eyes locked on the tracks she had left. He was no longer the hunted, but the hunter. driven by a desperate need to get to her side, to stand with her, to repay the impossible debt he owed her. He was driven by the guilt of his own survival and the fierce, protective love that now consumed him. And all around them, unseen but ever present, was the tightening circle of fate. The posse was not beaten, merely delayed. They were methodical, relentless, sweeping the territory, their net drawing ever closer around the two fugitives who dared to believe they could escape. The border was still days away, a finish line that seemed to recede with every painful step they took. Laredo was a town that lived on the edge of everything. It clung to the dusty banks of the Rio Grande, a final, chaotic gasp of the United States before the land gave way to Mexico. The air was thick with heat, the smells of dust, sweat, and chili. A world away from the clean, frozen purity of the Wyoming high plains. It was a town of desperate men and forgotten women, a place where pasts could be shed like old skins and futures could be bought, sold, or stolen. It was the perfect place to disappear. For 3 agonizing days, Eli had ridden toward it, fueled by a mixture of laudanum-laced coffee and a single, desperate hope. The pain in his leg was a constant, blinding fire, and his shoulder ached with a deep, weary throb. He was gaunt, his face a hollowed-out mask of exhaustion, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He was not just following a note, he was following the last, flickering light in his entire world. He rode into Laredo in the late afternoon, the setting sun painting the dusty streets in shades of blood and gold. He scanned every face, every alleyway, his heart a tight, painful knot in his chest. He started with the liveries, the most logical place. At the first, there was no sign of her, nor at the second. The knot in his chest tightened. He approached the third, a large, ramshackle stable at the far end of the main street, his hope worn down to a nub. And then he saw her. She was in the shaded runway of the stable, away from the harsh glare of the sun. She had her back to him, her focus entirely on the ugly mule she was tending to. A crude bandage was wrapped around her left forearm, stained with a small patch of dried blood. But she moved with a familiar, dogged purpose. She was humming a tune he did not recognize, a low, tuneless sound, as she worked a hoof-pick around the mule's shoe. She was alive. She was there, and she was acting as if it were just another ordinary day, as if she had not just ridden through a living hell to get here. Eli slid from his saddle, his wounded leg nearly giving out from under him. He leaned against the horse for a moment, the world tilting precariously. He took a breath, then another, and walked toward her, his footsteps unsteady in the thick dust. She must have heard him, or perhaps she simply felt his presence, because she stopped humming. Her shoulders went rigid. Slowly, deliberately, she finished cleaning the hoof and lowered the animal's leg to the ground. She stood there for a long moment, her back still to him, a statue carved from dust and resolve. Then she turned. Her face was thinner, etched with new lines of exhaustion, but her eyes, when they met his, were the same. They were the eyes he had seen in the firelight, the eyes that had looked at him with understanding and a fierce, protective love. The hoof-pick fell from her grasp, clattering softly in the dirt. Her hands, those capable, calloused hands that had tended his wounds and held his face, began to tremble. They stood in silence, the raucous noise of the border town fading into a distant hum. The world shrank to the 10 feet of dusty ground that separated them. Every hardship, every mile, every drop of blood shed on the long road that had brought them here culminated in this single, silent reunion. He took a step, then another, until he was standing in front of her. He could see the pulse beating at the base of her throat, the way she fought to keep her expression neutral, to maintain the hard facade that had kept her alive for so long. "You were hit," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He gently touched her bandaged arm. She flinched, but did not pull away. "It is just a graze," she said, her voice quiet. She looked at his leg. at the fresh blood that had soaked through his trousers. "You should not have followed me." "You knew I would," he replied. He had to ask. The question had haunted him every step of the way, a testament to his own guilt. "Why, Clara? Why did you not just keep running? You could have been halfway to Mexico by now. You could have been safe." She looked down at her trembling hands, then back up at him, her gaze unwavering. The hard facade finally crumbled, and all the pain and weariness of her long, lonely journey was plain to see on her face. "Because I was tired," she said, her voice thick with a truth so profound it seemed to steal the air from his lungs. "I was tired of surviving without reason." There, in the dusty stable, she confessed everything. Running alone was just a habit, a mindless continuation of an existence that had lost its purpose the day her father died. But running for him, fighting for him, that had given her a reason. He was her reason. It was the simplest and most complete declaration of love he had ever heard. He reached out and pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her as if he could absorb her into himself, shielding her from all the cruelty of the world. She collapsed against his chest, a shuddering sob finally breaking free from her. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was a woman who had gambled everything on a single, desperate hope, and against all odds, had won. For a brief, stolen hour, they allowed themselves to believe in a future. They sat in a quiet cantina, sharing a plate of beans and tortillas, the first real meal either of them had eaten in what felt like a lifetime. The warmth of the food and the simple act of sitting together, of being still, felt like an impossible luxury. They spoke in low voices, their plans taking shape like a fragile dream. "California," he said. "I hear you can pan for gold in the streams, and no one asks for your name. We could get a small piece of land, a real farm." "I have never seen the ocean," she whispered. The idea so foreign and wonderful it was hard to grasp. "Is it as big as they say?" "Bigger," he promised, his hand covering hers on the rough wooden table. "Big enough to wash away everything that came before." They would start again. They would build a life from the ashes of their old ones. The thought was so beautiful, so full of hope, that it was almost painful. They finished their meal and walked back out into the fading sunlight. A new, lighter step in their walk. They would buy supplies, a new horse for her, and ride west with the dawn, beyond the reach of the law, beyond the ghosts that haunted them. They were almost free. As they stepped out of the cantina, a man was walking past. He was tall, with a weary face and a silver star pinned to his vest. He glanced at them, a cursory look, and then his eyes stopped on Eli. A flicker of recognition crossed his features. His gaze sharpened. "Hold it right there," the sheriff said, his voice flat and tired. Clara and Eli froze, the hopeful dream shattering into a million pieces. The sheriff's hand rested on the butt of his gun. "Elijah Vance," he said. It was not a question. "I have a poster for you. You are under arrest for the murder of Silas Croft." Time seemed to slow down. The sounds of the street, the laughter, the music, the Spanish conversation, all faded away. There was only the dusty street, the tired lawman, and the sudden, brutal end of their dream. Eli's hand moved instinctively, his fingers wrapping around the grip of the revolver Clara had given him. He was not thinking of a fight. He was thinking only of her, of getting her away, of the promise of the ocean. "Do not do it, son," the sheriff warned, drawing his own weapon. Two deputies appeared from across the street, their guns already drawn. They were trapped. Eli shoved Clara behind him. "Run!" he ordered, his voice a low growl. But she did not run. She stood her ground, her hand grabbing his arm. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "Not without you." It was all the time the deputies needed. One of them, a young man with nervous eyes, fired. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dust. The street erupted into chaos. People screamed, diving for cover. Another shot rang out. Eli fired back, not at the men, but at a water trough beside them, the splintering wood and gushing water creating a momentary distraction. He grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the livery, toward the horses, toward their only chance of escape. They ran, ducking low, as bullets whizzed through the air around them. One of the deputies dropped to one knee, taking careful aim. The street was clear for a moment, a straight line between his gun and Eli's back. Clara saw it. She saw the deputy's eyes squint, his finger tighten on the trigger. There was no time to shout, no time to push him out of the way. There was only time for a single, final choice. In that split second, she was no longer the girl who had hidden in the rocks. She was the woman who had faced down bandits, who had ridden into a blizzard, who had set a forest ablaze to protect the man she loved. She was done surviving without reason. She threw herself backward, her body a shield between Eli and the bullet. The impact was a dull, brutal thud. A gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes went wide with a kind of profound surprise. Eli felt her hand go limp in his, felt her dead weight pull him to a halt. He turned, catching her as she fell. The shooting stopped. A stunned silence fell over the dusty street. Eli lowered her gently to the ground, her head cradled in his lap. A dark, crimson stain was spreading rapidly across the front of her simple dress. "Clara!" he choked out, his voice breaking. "No, no!" She looked up at him, her eyes already starting to glaze over. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows, bathing them in a soft, golden light. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She raised a trembling hand to his face, her touch as light as a feather. "You ride," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. A single tear tracked a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "And take me with you." Her hand fell away. Her eyes stared, unseeing, at the vast, indifferent sky. She was gone. A raw, animal cry of pure agony was torn from Eli's throat. He held her body, rocking back and forth, the world dissolving into a meaningless blur of grief and rage. The sheriff and his deputies approached cautiously, their faces grim. "It is over, son," the sheriff said, his voice softer now. But it was not over. Eli laid Clara's head gently on the ground. He picked up her locket, a small, silver oval she always wore, its chain broken in the fall. He clutched it in his fist. He looked at the lawman, and his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man, but of a wounded wolf, with nothing left to lose. He came up firing, the old Colt bucking in his hand. A wild, desperate barrage that sent them diving for cover. In the ensuing chaos, he scrambled to his feet, grabbed the reins of the nearest horse, and swung himself into the saddle. Another bullet grazed his side, a fresh, searing pain, but he barely felt it. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks and galloped out of Laredo, leaving behind the body of the woman who had saved him, the setting sun, and the last of his own soul. Months later, travelers on the westward trails began to speak of a legend. They told stories in hushed tones around their campfires of a lone rider they sometimes saw at dusk, a solitary figure moving against the blood-red horizon. He had a haunted, far-off look in his eyes, and he always led a second horse, a sturdy mule with an empty saddle on its back. Some said that if you listened closely as he passed, you could hear him whispering to the wind, a quiet, one-sided conversation with a ghost only he could see. The story ends on a cold, clear night, deep in the heart of a vast, empty wilderness. Eli sat by a small, crackling fire, the star-dusted sky a canopy of silent, glittering diamonds above him. His horse and the mule stood tethered nearby. Beside the fire, propped against a log, was an empty, worn leather saddle. He stared into the flames, his face illuminated by the dancing light. He clutched a silver locket in his hand, its metal worn smooth from his constant touch. He watched the flames twist and sway, and in their hypnotic, shifting shapes, he could almost see her there, sitting beside him in the glow, her eyes full of a fierce, gentle light. He had survived, and as he had promised, he had taken her with him. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.